So first, I want to start with Sarah Siegal. Sarah, you worked with Carol Connor when she was conducting research into how students learn to read. Can you share with us today a little bit about what Carol and that research team learned about different student profiles and the need for differentiation in types of instruction?
Absolutely. And hey, everyone, I'm so happy to be here to talk about this today. So one of the big things that we found through Carol's work was that it's not only about applying the science of reading and these overarching theories that we know about, but it's also the fact that different students respond to these things differently. So some aspects might benefit students more in one area than it benefits a different student with a different profile. And so one of the kind of overarching concepts that I want to really get across today is that different kids need different things to be successful. This doesn't mean that certain areas, especially some of these ideas that we know are supported by research overall, aren't effective, but it means they might be more effective in some cases than others. And so I really want to kind of think about this as the central piece here. That is also why it's so hard to apply the science of reading, right? If every student is going to respond slightly differently, how do we really put these overarching theories into practice in our classrooms? And so to kind of tie this idea in overall, I want to go back and connect this idea to the science of reading and also to my background as a developmental psychologist and kind of this connection between how students learn how to read and write and also child development overall. So first, if you were at that first session, Emily kind of touched on some of these things, but I want to make sure that everyone's familiar with them. There is the overarching kind of view that's often presented in science of reading conversations called the simple view of reading. And this essentially spells out the fact that reading comprehension or reading for understanding, our final goal for teaching kids to read, is really made up of two parts: decoding and language comprehension. And so students can fall anywhere on the spectrum of those two areas. So some common examples we might see are an English language learner might have really good word recognition. They're learning how to decode these words just along with their grade level peers, but might have lower language comprehension where they're not as clear on understanding what they're actually reading. We may have other students who have really good oral language, vocabulary, comprehension skills, but poor decoding. And so those students might fall in a different quadrant on the spectrum, but both of those components are playing a role for reading comprehension. The other thing that's really important to consider here, right, is if decoding or language comprehension is 0, the whole equation falls apart. So we really need to support both of these skill areas. The other graphic that's really commonly used when we're kind of thinking about the science of reading and these overarching concepts is Scarborough's rope. So this is essentially really telling that same story, right? Comprehension or skilled reading here is made up of two components: language comprehension and word recognition. And it's a bunch of the sub-skills that make up these two components, as well as this increased automaticity and strategic use of these different skills that lead to that skilled reading comprehension. But as I mentioned, neither one of these really take into account student development changes over time. So the question is, if different students need different things, how does development play a role? And so this is the way I like to kind of pull all these things together. This is called Bronfenbrenner's bioecological model. And essentially the takeaway here is that there's all of these different variables playing a role, right? So you can see the little blackboard diagram representing school, but there's also other factors that are going to be influencing how and what a student learns when. And so the other piece that we really want to start thinking about is how time can play a role into understanding student learning and how specifically reading comprehension develops over time. So there's kind of two different ways to really think about this idea. The first is kind of from a historical time point. And so that's where I want to start. And so what you're seeing here is this drastic difference between how oral language or vocabulary really emerged in the human timeline versus written language. So you can see here, spoken language has been around for a long time. And, evolutionarily, you can probably think of some reasons that might be the case. If you can understand one grunt means food, another means danger, you're going to survive a lot longer. A lot of beneficial areas that's impacting. However, written language really took much, much longer to emerge. And it actually wasn't until the printing press was invented in 1439 where written language was actually available to the public. And so you can just see, as kind of thinking about it from a historical perspective, there's a much different impact that understanding verbal communication and learning to read has played based on this timeline. But the other way we can think about this is just in individual child development. And so the big takeaway here is that language is an innate skill that's learned through exposure. And so this graph here is showing an infant from ages 6 months to 12 across the x-axis there. And you can see really early on, about 6 to 8 months of age, they can actually differentiate between different sounds regardless of language. So this is an example of an infant born into an English-speaking home that was then played sounds in either Hindi, which is the blue bars, or another language. I have it written on the slide. I will not try to pronounce it, but these two other languages, and they essentially played two different phonemes or sounds that are important in those languages. And up until 8 months, this infant could distinguish between the sounds. They're able to understand that the sound had changed as well as in English, but look at how fast that ability drops off. By the time they're 10 to 12 months old, they're only recognizing differences in Hindi about 20% of the time. So you start to narrow down the language differences, the sounds that are meaningful for you, for your communication. And this is something, that it wasn't explicitly taught during those 12 months. It's just something that infants automatically start doing when exposed to language.
So Sarah, this is all really interesting. And, I'm curious, how does this play out across the K-3 space? And how does what children need change over time as they move through the early grades?
Great question. And this is exactly why it's so important to remember that there are these differences, right? And so if we're saying language is something that's going to be developed based on experiences a child has or vocabulary, that's going to start developing at birth. And again, if we think back to that developmental model, there are many different variables or components that might be impacting that growth. However, decoding, or the actual act of learning to read, is not an innate process. And so this is where I really like to lay out the kind of difference in development between something that's happening innately through those experiences or requires explicit direct instruction. And so if you look at this graph, we're really calling out those same two components from the simple view of reading. Here they're labeled decoding and vocabulary, if you think of that as kind of language comprehension. And the blue line represents those decoding skills. So they really don't start developing and growing until maybe preschool, kindergarten, when that student is now learning that words are made up of sounds, so sounds can be represented by letters, and combining those and practicing those allows them to automatically and fluently start translating the symbols that make up our words into something they're actually understanding. And another way I kind of like to think about this is you're essentially, from kindergarten to about 3rd grade, trying to get that decoding ability to catch up to a student's language or understanding. And this is where we see a huge switch developmentally as well, from learning to read to reading to learn, where once you have those decoding skills, you can really start to learn new words, new concepts in a comprehension setting, where before you were learning just to decode the words that you were already using in your oral language. So I think development really plays a huge role in how we think about these things kind of coming together to form that final goal of reading for understanding.
Well, this is really interesting. So, you've given us a lot of insights into, what the research and science tells us. Can you share a little bit with us now how we apply this research, and both in the classroom and across systems?
Absolutely. And this is where the central idea comes back around, right? So now we're kind of understanding another variable that's at play here, development, but we still haven't touched on the fact that if different kids are all over the map here, what do they need to be successful? And so that's really where we're going to get into the how to apply the science of reading in the classroom. And so the first thing that I really want to kind of point out here is there are 2 levels to thinking about how to apply this. And if you've read any of Emily Hanford's articles or heard her presentation, one of the things she touched on was that even as teachers are exposed to this information and start using it, they often feel like they're all alone, or they kind of have to hide it. And so in our work in our current school partners, we've really seen that the #1 component that's needed to be in place here is support at the systems level. So you have a teacher who's central to this, but they need support from the community, from state policy, and especially from their district to actually put these science of reading theories into action in their classroom. So what does that look like? So first we have a fragmented landscape in the current educational setting. So many teachers have told us, I have assessments over here, they're not connected to my curriculum at all, I have all of these different initiatives, it seems like nothing is moving together, and it also means then that it's really hard to get aligned. And one of the reasons that we're really seeing this is because research and practice don't talk to each other. So we have a lot of these great theories and things like the simple view of reading and the science of reading, but they're just not making it into the classroom in a way that's applicable or helpful or even making that jump at all. And the other piece that seems to happen from this is what teachers are being provided is not nuanced enough or kind of broad enough to really start aligning these separate pieces. So the teacher's trapped in the middle there, a little bit frustrated because they're getting these tiny bits and pieces that may have been evidence-based, but they're not fitting into an overarching theory. So if we can create this systems alignment, it paints a much different picture. And this is what that can look like. So thinking back to that previous slide here, first, everything is now pointed in the same direction. If we know K-3 literacy is a critical component, we can start aligning all of these apparently disconnected pieces into one now. So we're all trying to face the same direction. The other thing that's really helpful is once we're aligning, there is the ability for us to fill in the gaps. If we know something's missing, we can fill it in. And the final piece here is that we now have a lot more room on the slide, right? So instead of feeling like, okay, there's just another initiative, it's just one more thing, we're really saying, how does that fit into this overarching goal that we're facing? And so if districts can create that kind of supportive system for a teacher, there is a lot more ability to now start applying what's actually evidence-based. So one of the ways we do that, and a lot of my research currently is based on this support system called the A2I professional support system. And that is what we use to really start connecting some specific pieces. Here you can see them on our diagram that teachers and districts are feeling are really not connected and start aligning them to that central goal. But there's one more piece that still needs to be addressed here, and that's really the teacher in the classroom. So if the teacher supported, the system alignment is in place, how can they start applying the science of reading for their students? And this is also where we really now get into information about different students needing different things to be successful. What our work has found is that children can enter a classroom with a number of these different profiles: high word recognition, low vocabulary, high on both, and all of these things have different implications for what they actually need to receive from the teacher. So here's just one kind of simplified example. This red line represents the amount of time a student entering a first grade classroom needs to spend on teacher-managed code-focused instruction. So when we say code-focused, we mean anything that has to do with phonics, decoding, turning those sounds and letters into actual words that they're reading. And so the x-axis here demonstrates where a student's reading ability might actually be. Even though this is a first grade classroom, you might be entering at a kindergarten level, at a second grade reading level, and anywhere in between. So if we do have a student entering this classroom at a kindergarten level, so almost a year behind, they need about 30 minutes of teacher-managed, code-focused instruction a day to meet that end goal of reading at grade level. But if you enter that classroom and you are reading at grade level already, right where that arrow is pointing, you only need 10 minutes. So all of these aspects that we're really promoting through phonics instruction and having the other type of instruction that we usually consider is called meaning-focused instruction, so more of that vocabulary or language components, both are important, but for different kids, they're more important in different areas. What makes this a little complex is there are actually a lot of different things going on in the classroom, right? So I mentioned that we have code or meaning-focused instruction, and we can also have teacher or child-managed delivery. So students are going to benefit, some students are going to benefit more from teacher-guided instruction, where they're getting explicit instruction from the teacher and being able to ask questions. And some students, if they just need to be introduced to a topic and are good to go, they're going to benefit more from child-managed instruction in those areas. And so we've actually been able to create these algorithms that allow us to tell teachers not only where students are at, but what instruction they need. And so as you can see from this graph, that it's pretty complex. And so we've actually harnessed technology to provide these recommendations for teachers. And that's where the A2I professional support system really comes in. Is instead of having to look at all these, we always call that the spaghetti graph, look at all these crazy different recommendations, we can just produce the individualized needs of each student for the teacher. And through this software platform, we're able to start now saying, here is what the science of reading says, here's what the individual students need to be successful, and here's how the teacher can use that information. But again, all of this has to operate within this aligned system. And so that's where the full support system comes into play. And so we found that we need to identify where students are at through assessments, provide those instructional recommendations and align to materials and practices teachers are already using to meet those student needs. But finally, there is this additional need for customized support that, again, help teachers directly translate the information they're getting into practice in the classroom. And so we have embedded professional development and support that allows that true systems alignment to be put into play in every single classroom. So the overarching kind of takeaway here then is that the research has really shown teaching kids to read is really complex because different kids need different things to be successful. But through the help of this alignment, we can really start now recommending to teachers exactly what students need. We know what instruction will benefit what kids most, and the challenge is just putting that into place. And so I know that's some of the pieces that Faith and Todd are going to touch on too, is how does that really look?